The Galactic Council's signal crackled over the screens across the colony of Volterra. Panic swept through the streets as the announcement repeated, its cold tone devoid of emotion. Asterisk. All resistance will be eradicated. Comply, or be destroyed. Asterisk. In the capital city, families huddled together, eyes wide as they listened to the broadcast. They had heard of the Xerx, the Council's ruthless enforcers, but never expected to face them on their own soil. Near the outskirts, a small rebel group led by Juno Crest stood tense. Sweat dripped from her brow, but she steadied her breath, clutching her blaster tightly. The sound of thunderous footsteps echoed in the distance. The Xerx were coming. They're here, someone whispered. Juno squinted at the horizon. Emerging from the dust were figures, moving in eerie synchrony. Cold-blooded killers, every movement efficient, emotionless. They were terrifying in their precision, hulking yet swift, each one designed for a singular purpose: eliminate all resistance. No mercy. We make our stand here, Juno declared, though her voice trembled slightly. The others nodded, fear masked by the determination in their eyes. The ground trembled as the Xerx advanced. Juno's team opened fire, the bright beams of plasma hitting the invaders. But the Xerx were undeterred. One by one, Juno's people were cut down, their screams echoing in the streets. Bodies fell around her, each death a brutal testament to the enemy's lethal efficiency. Behind the scenes, the Galactic Council monitored the assault. It was not a war to them, it was a calculated extermination. In the midst of the chaos, a young child stumbled onto the battlefield, crying for her mother. Juno rushed forward, shoving her gun aside. But before she could reach the girl, a Xerx stepped in her path. Its eyes, devoid of empathy, locked on her. For a split second, the world froze. Then it moved to strike. Suddenly, a blast from above shattered the air. The Xerx crumpled, its body a lifeless heap. Juno turned, shocked, as several dark figures descended from the skies, humans, clad in advanced combat gear unlike anything she'd ever seen. They moved with an energy the Xerx lacked, agility, purpose, and something deeper. It wasn't just their speed or strength that set them apart. It was the fury in their eyes, the unyielding drive to fight back. This wasn't just survival, this was vengeance. From one of the figures, a voice crackled through Juno's earpiece. We've got you covered. Super soldiers, Commander Kane leading. Kane's figure loomed as he surveyed the battlefield. His squad, too, was unlike anything the galaxy had seen, larger than ordinary humans, but not monstrous like the Xerx. Instead, they radiated a controlled power. Kane's voice was calm but commanding. Your fight is over, Crest. We're taking it from here. The Xerx, recognizing a new threat, shifted their focus. But the super soldiers were ready. Kane's squad surged forward, tearing through the ranks of the alien killers with terrifying precision. Where the Xerx relied on efficiency and brutal force, the super soldiers danced with the chaos, dodging and weaving, adapting to every change in the battle's flow. Kane, at the front, locked onto one of the larger Xerx. The creature snarled, lunging with its blade-like arms. Kane dodged, his reflexes lightning fast, and countered with a brutal strike, his fist cracking through the Xerx's armored skull. Behind him, his squad moved with the same savage grace. Where the Xerx were predictable, the super soldiers thrived in unpredictability, their ability to think on their feet making them a deadly match for the cold-blooded aliens. Juno watched in awe as the tide of battle turned. The Xerx, so fearsome moments ago, now seemed vulnerable. The super soldiers fought with a determination and ferocity that no alien weapon could match. Still, it was clear that the super soldiers were not invincible. One of Kane's men, a hulking figure named Rook, took a hit from a Xerx blade, the armor barely holding. With a roar, Rook grabbed the Xerx, twisting its head until the creature's neck snapped. But even as he triumphed, the strain on his face was evident. Juno noticed something strange in Kane's eyes. It wasn't just battle focus, it was something darker, deeper, almost animalistic. She realized then that these soldiers weren't like the regular humans she knew. They were something else, something more, and something far more dangerous. As the last of the Xerx fell, Kane wiped the blood from his hands, his face expressionless. His squad stood tall amidst the rubble, victorious but silent, their eyes scanning for any sign of more enemies. Juno approached cautiously. What are you?" Kane's eyes flickered with something unsettling. "We're what humanity has been hiding. We're here to finish what the Council started." Before Juno could ask more, Kane's comm crackled. "Volterra is secure. Move to extraction point. Await further orders." Without a word, the super soldiers moved, as if the battle had never happened. Kane glanced back once at Juno. "This war isn't over. It's just beginning." And with that, they vanished into the night, leaving behind a world forever changed. The air over Volterra hung heavy with the scent of blood and smoke, but Commander Kane and his squad of super soldiers were already on the move, heading deeper into the heart of the city. The wreckage of the Xerx lay in their wake, but there was no time to celebrate. They knew this was just the beginning. As they maneuvered through the streets, Kane's earpiece buzzed with static. "Council forces are regrouping," the voice on the other end reported. "They're sending reinforcements, heavier artillery, more Xerx. It's only a matter of time." Kane's jaw tightened. "Understood. We'll hold the line until extraction." His team followed closely behind, every movement sharp and disciplined. They were relentless, designed to be the perfect soldiers, but Kane couldn't shake the weight growing in his chest. He had seen the price of power before. Every fight left him and his men more like the enemies they destroyed, more machine than man. But there was no turning back now. "Contact east side!" Rook's voice broke through Kane's thoughts as the squad halted. A fresh wave of Xerx poured into the streets, larger and more armored than the first wave. Their cold, glowing eyes locked onto the super soldiers, and with the same emotionless brutality, they charged forward. But Kane and his team didn't hesitate. They moved as one, responding not with panic but with precision. Shots rang out. Plasma blades hummed. The battle erupted again. Rook, still nursing the injury from the last fight, hurled himself at the nearest Xerx, smashing through its defenses with sheer brute strength. Another Xerx lunged, but before it could land a blow, Lieutenant Mara, one of the faster soldiers in Kane's unit, darted in and sliced clean through its limbs, moving too quickly for the creature to counter. "Don't give them an inch!" Mara shouted, her voice sharp. But the Xerx had learned from their earlier defeat. They adapted faster now, using coordinated strikes and advanced tactics that even the super soldiers found difficult to predict. One of the alien assassins managed to pin Kane against the wall, its claws scraping across his reinforced armor, searching for a weak point. Kane's muscles tensed, his vision narrowing. The primal rage, always lurking just beneath the surface, surged within him. With a guttural roar, he slammed his fist into the Xerx's chest, breaking through its armor with raw, unchecked force. The creature crumpled, but Kane barely registered the kill. His heart pounded, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he had controlled the rage or if it had controlled him. The battle was chaos, with the super soldiers and Xerx locked in a deadly dance. But something in the Xerx's relentless precision sparked a dangerous realization in Kane. These aliens weren't simply reacting. They were studying them, learning from every move. And they weren't just here to fight, they were here to exterminate. "They're adapting," Kane said through gritted teeth, dodging another attack. "They're reading us like data points. Every fight, they get smarter. Then we need to outsmart them," Mara replied, narrowly avoiding a blow. "If they want a war of tactics, let's give them one." Kane's mind raced. The Xerx may have had the upper hand in pure strength and numbers, but they lacked the one thing that humanity excelled at: creativity, unpredictability. His team wasn't bound by protocols or programming. They could think on their feet, improvise in ways these cold-blooded killers couldn't comprehend. "Fall back to the alleyways," Kane ordered, his voice firm. "We'll use the terrain to our advantage. They won't expect us to go guerrilla." Rook, bloodied but determined, took down another Xerx with a violent swing before retreating alongside Mara and the others. The super soldiers moved swiftly through the maze of narrow streets and debris, drawing the Xerx into choke points where their numbers counted for nothing. Kane watched as the Xerx hesitated for the first time, unsure how to proceed. The emotionless creatures weren't designed for chaos. They thrived on control, on calculated precision. And now, the battlefield was anything but. Now! Kane barked. His team sprang the trap. Mara and Rook attacked from the flanks while Kane barreled through the center, catching the Xerx off guard. Plasma fire cut through the air, and one by one, the alien killers fell. It wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. The battle raged on, and with every passing moment, Kane felt the weight pressing down on him. The super soldiers were winning, but it came at a cost. Each kill, each moment of raw aggression, pulled them further into the darkness of their own making. It was as if the line between man and monster blurred with every swing of their fists, every pull of the trigger. "Commander," Mara said, breathing heavily as she stood over the body of a fallen Xerx. "We can't keep this up forever. They're relentless." Kane nodded, wiping blood from his face. He knew she was right. They were running on borrowed time, and every second they spent in the fight risked something deeper, something they couldn't afford to lose. Then, the call came through. "Extraction point is compromised," the voice said, cold and clipped. "Council forces have intercepted. You're on your own." Kane's chest tightened, but he didn't falter. "We don't need extraction," he growled into his calm. "We'll finish this." But even as the words left his mouth, Kane knew the truth. They weren't just fighting the Xerx. They were fighting themselves, fighting the urge to give in to the primal power coursing through their veins. If they survived, they'd have to reckon with what they had become. And if they didn't, there would simply be another casualty in a war where humanity had gambled too much. Rook staggered over, his massive frame dripping with sweat and blood. "What's the plan, Commander?" Kane looked around at the remnants of his squad, battered but still standing. He could see the toll the battle had taken on them. But he also saw the fire in their eyes, the will to keep fighting, to survive no matter the cost. "The plan," Kane said, gripping his weapon tighter, "is we make sure they remember who they're dealing with." And with that, they prepared for the next wave, knowing that even if they won this battle, the real war was only just beginning. The cold silence of the command center settled over Kane as he stood at the helm, surveying the holographic map of the battlefield. Lines of red dotted the city's perimeter, enemy forces, moving in tighter. There wasn't much time left. Behind him, the squad was patching themselves up, taking stock of their supplies. They were exhausted, bruised, and bloodied, but none of them voiced the obvious. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and almost out of time. Mara stepped forward, her face tense. "Commander, we need a new extraction point. There's no way we're getting through their reinforcements without support." Kane didn't respond immediately. His eyes traced the movements of the enemy forces on the map, his mind racing through the possibilities. None of them looked good. "I'm working on it," he said, his voice rough. Mara frowned. "Kane, we're not going to survive much longer at this pace. We need to regroup, I said I'm working on it." Kane cut her off, his voice sharper than intended. Mara recoiled slightly but held her ground. Rook, sitting nearby, grunted as he tightened the bandage around his leg. "She's right, Commander. We've been pushing ourselves to the limit. We're not invincible." Kane turned toward them both, the weight of command hanging heavy in his eyes. "You think I don't know that? I know what's at stake here. But right now, survival isn't the objective." Mara exchanged a glance with Rook, her brows furrowed. "Then what is?" Kane took a deep breath, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. His voice was low, deliberate. "We've been fighting this war like it's a battle for survival, but we've lost sight of the bigger picture. We're not just soldiers, we're humanity's last stand." Mara's eyes narrowed, her frustration bubbling over. "And what does that mean, Kane? You're talking like we're expendable," he finished for her. "Because we are. This mission isn't about us getting out alive. It's about making sure the Council doesn't win." It's about sending a message they can't ignore. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Rook shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. You're saying we're supposed to die out here? That's the plan? Kane stared him down, unflinching. If it comes to that, yes. This fight isn't about us. It's about making sure the Council pays for every inch they try to take. Mara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. And what about the team? What about the people who trusted you to lead them out of this? Kane's expression softened for a moment, but there was no hesitation in his gaze. I'm doing what I have to. What we all signed up for. We're soldiers, Mara. We knew the risks the moment we took this mission. Before she could respond, a sudden crackle of static filled the room. Kane tapped his earpiece, the voice on the other end coming through distorted but clear enough to understand. Commander Kane, this is General Vasquez. We've managed to break through their communications. Reinforcements are on their way, but they'll take time to reach you. How long? Kane asked, his voice steady. Best estimate is 6 hours. Maybe more. Can you hold out until then? Kane's jaw clenched. 6 hours might as well have been 6 days. The enemy forces were closing in, and his team was already running on fumes. But there was no other option. We'll hold, he said, his voice firm. Good luck, Commander. Vasquez out? The room was silent again, the reality of the situation settling over them. 6 hours. That was all the time they had to hold the line, and even then, there were no guarantees. Rook stood, his legs still bleeding through the bandage, but he didn't complain. He looked at Kane with something close to respect. So, what's the plan, Commander? Kane stared at the holographic map, the red dots slowly advancing. We draw them in. Make them think they've got us on the ropes. Then we hit them with everything we've got. Mara crossed her arms, skeptical. And if that doesn't work? Kane met her gaze, unflinching. Then we make sure we take as many of them with us as possible. The squad moved quickly, setting up defenses along the remaining choke points of the city. Every corridor, every alleyway became a potential kill zone. They didn't have the firepower to match the Xerx in a straight fight, but they had one advantage the enemy didn't: home turf. They knew the city, knew its ins and outs, and that was the edge they would need. Kane stood at the front, his plasma rifle slung over his shoulder. He knew what this was. He knew the odds. But that didn't matter now. All that mattered was the mission. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the air grew thick. The distant sounds of the enemy's approach echoed through the city streets, like the slow beat of a war drum. They were coming, and there was no stopping them. Mara crouched beside Kane, her eyes scanning the horizon. They're close. Kane nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. Stay sharp. They'll come hard, but we'll hit harder. The first wave of Xerx appeared on the edge of the city, their glowing eyes reflecting off the shattered glass of the buildings. Kane felt his heart pound in his chest, but he didn't flinch. Wait for my signal, he whispered into his comm. The Xerx moved methodically, their footsteps heavy against the cracked pavement. They hadn't spotted the traps yet. They hadn't realized how close they were walking to their own graves. Kane waited, his finger hovering over the trigger. His breath was slow, controlled. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. Then, with a single motion, he raised his hand and brought it down. Now! The trap sprang to life. Explosions rocked the streets as buildings collapsed on top of the advancing Xerx. Plasma turrets hidden in the rubble fired in unison, cutting down the enemy forces before they could react. But the Xerx weren't so easily defeated. As the dust settled, more of them emerged from the smoke, larger and more dangerous than before. The second wave was upon them. Kane gritted his teeth, standing tall as the enemy charged. Hold the line! He shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Mara and Rook were at his side, fighting with everything they had. Plasma bolts filled the air, bodies fell, and the line held, for now. But Kane knew this was just the beginning. They might survive the night, but dawn would bring new horrors. Kane felt the weight of the hours press down on him. The fight had raged longer than any of them had expected. The reinforcements promised by Vasquez were nowhere to be seen, and the city, now a war zone, was crumbling around them. His team was barely holding on. Plasma burns marked their armor, exhaustion painted every face. Mara crouched beside him, panting, blood smeared on her cheek. She looked up at him, her voice hoarse. "We can't keep this up, Kane. We're out of ammo, out of options." Kane didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the battlefield. It was a wasteland of rubble and bodies, the ground littered with the fallen, human and alien alike. The enemy was relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. But there was no retreat, no surrender. He couldn't let the council win. He wouldn't. Rook limped over, clutching his side, where a fresh wound bled through his uniform. "Commander," he grunted, "they're massing for another push. This might be the last one." Kane's gaze hardened. "Then we make it count." Rook snorted, though there was no humor in it. "Always the optimist." Kane stepped forward, addressing his battered squad. "Listen up! We've held this line longer than anyone thought we could. We've pushed them back again and again, and now they're desperate. This is their final play, and it's ours too. We hold this ground, we bleed them dry." Mara stood, her hand resting on her rifle, even though it had only a few rounds left. "We're with you, Kane. But if this is the end—" "It's not the end," Kane said, cutting her off. "Not yet." The sound of footsteps grew louder in the distance. The Xerx were coming again, and this time, they weren't holding back. Massive war machines marched forward, flanked by swarms of smaller infantry. The sky was dark with smoke, and the air crackled with the energy of their weapons. Mara wiped her brow, gripping her rifle tighter. "Here they come." The squad moved into position, what was left of them. Kane stood at the front, plasma rifle raised, every muscle in his body tense. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was this moment, this final stand. The first blast hit, a shockwave that rattled the ground beneath them. Kane's boots slid against the dirt, but he held firm, firing at the advancing line. The Xerx were relentless, their war cries echoing through the ruins. "Hold the line!" Kane shouted over the chaos. Mara fired beside him, her shots precise, though fewer and fewer. "We're almost out!" she shouted, glancing at Kane, her eyes wide with desperation. Kane didn't hesitate. "Conserve your fire! Wait until they're closer!" The enemy surged forward, closing the distance rapidly. Kane's finger tightened on the trigger, releasing a barrage of plasma that cut through the nearest Xerx. Bodies fell, but more took their place, relentless in their advance. Rook let out a battle cry, taking down a massive Xerx with a well-placed shot, but even he was struggling. "We're getting overrun!" he shouted, his voice strained as he reloaded what little ammunition he had left. Kane's mind raced. They couldn't last much longer like this. He activated his comm, hoping against hope. "Vasquez, this is Kane. We need that support now. Do you copy?" Static crackled in his ear, the only response he received. His jaw clenched, frustration boiling under the surface. They were on their own. Another explosion rocked the ground near them, sending debris flying. Kane ducked, narrowly avoiding the shrapnel. The war machines were getting closer, their footsteps shaking the earth. "Kane!" Mara shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "We need a miracle, or we're done!" Kane knew she was right. He scanned the battlefield again, searching for anything they could use, anything that might give them the edge they needed. His eyes landed on a half-destroyed fuel depot at the far end of the street. It was risky, maybe even suicidal, but it was their only shot. "Mara, Rook!" he called out. "See that depot? We blow it, we can take out their war machines and buy ourselves some time." Mara looked at the depot, her expression grim. "You're crazy." "Yeah, well," Kane said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Crazy's all we've got left." Rook grunted, limping toward him. "What's the plan?" Kane laid it out quickly. Mara, you and I will cover Rook while he sets the charges. Once it's rigged, we fall back and detonate it. We take out as many of those bastards as we can. Mara nodded, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. And if it doesn't work? Kane didn't answer. It had to work. There was no other option. They moved quickly, dodging fire as they made their way toward the depot. The Zareks were closing in, their war machines bearing down on them with terrifying speed. Plasma bolts zipped past, scorching the air, but Kane pushed forward, his focus singular. Rook reached the depot first, dropping to one knee as he fumbled with the explosives. His hands were shaking, blood dripping from his wounds, but he didn't stop. Almost there, he muttered, his fingers working quickly. Kane and Mara stood guard, firing at the advancing enemy. Kane's rifle overheated, and he cursed under his breath, switching to his sidearm. The Zareks were closing in fast, their sheer numbers overwhelming. "Hurry up, Rook!" Mara shouted, her voice strained. "I'm going as fast as I can." Rook snapped, sweat pouring down his face. Kane fired again, taking down a Zarek that had gotten too close. His heart pounded in his chest, his muscles burning with exhaustion. They were running out of time. Finally, Rook stood, panting. "Charge is set." Kane nodded. "Fall back. Now!" They sprinted away from the depot, plasma fire raining down around them. Kane's lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but he kept moving, pushing through the pain. As they reached the edge of the blast radius, Kane turned, detonating the charges. The explosion that followed was deafening, a massive fireball that engulfed the war machines and sent shockwaves through the city. The ground trembled beneath their feet as debris rained down. For a moment, there was silence. Then the calm crackled to life. Vasquez's voice, strained but clear, broke through. "Kane, reinforcements inbound. Hold tight." Kane exhaled, lowering his weapon. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe they might just make it out of this alive.